Hey guys, tonight we're going to explore the 12 worst habits of Henry VIII, the man nicknamed the bloodthirsty king and infamous for his 6 tragic marriages. Imagine you're sitting in a warm room as a chill wind sweeps through the cold stone walls. The wheels of your chair creak, and you catch faint whiffs of strong wine and rotting food. You won't survive hearing all those horrifying details. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Just after the lights have been dimmed and the steady hum of the fan has settled in, we step into the hushed realm of the Tudor court, where its darkest secrets await revelation. In the night air, as the wind whispers through cold stone window frames, the figure of Henry VIII emerges majestic yet haunting, a king powerful enough to reshape religious institutions, yet powerless to avert the tragic downfall of his own flesh. Henry VIII, the illustrious monarch of the Tudor dynasty, was celebrated not only for his strategic genius and diplomatic acumen, but also became the very embodiment of ruthless determination to protect the crown. Born amid the finest silks and entrusted with absolute authority, he quickly realized that power brooked no retreat. Yet his grandest ambition was not territorial expansion, but casting aside all constraints to secure a single male heir who would inherit his throne. The break with the Pope was not merely a religious upheaval, but a brazen rebuke to Roman authority. When Katherine of Aragon failed to bear him a son, Henry did not hesitate to establish the Church of England himself, legitimizing his divorce and clearing the path to new consorts. This decision carved a new course in history, yet sowed seeds of hatred and deep division throughout the kingdom. But Henry's cruelty did not stop there. He transcended all moral boundaries by ordering the execution of his first 2 wives. The trials of Anne Boleyn and Katherine Howard were not truly about adultery or treason, but the inevitable result of boundless ambition discarding them once they ceased to serve in his quest for a prince to succeed. These show trials, built on hollow evidence and fabricated accusations, cemented the image of a king willing to annihilate anything that stood in the way of his desires. At his height, Henry VIII was lauded for his robust physique and angelic countenance, a paragon among European princes. Yet those glorious feats could not mask the tragedy that befell him later. Declining health, a volatile temperament, and an obsessive drive for an heir turned the once vaunted monarch into an increasingly merciless figure. In his final years, Henry lived in seclusion, his servants recoiling from the ever-festering ulcer on his right thigh, a wound that rotted and stank so foul that its odor permeated 3 rooms. The mingled scents of decay, fine wine, and pungent court perfumes created a suffocating atmosphere, forcing anyone raising a handkerchief to their nose to suppress waves of horror. His body swelled beyond 180 kilograms, his waist exceeding 3 meters, compelling the palace to widen doorways and design pulley systems for his transport. Each step he took was a painful dirge, the groans from his wound, a merciless reminder that power could not buy a healthy body. In those final, endlessly bleak days, none could help but wonder, were those ruthless decisions the price of ultimate authority? Or did absolute power itself drive a man from glory into the depths of his own ruin? This series will unveil 12 horrifying truths about Henry VIII, from his filthy habits and paranoid mindset to his cold-blooded political schemes. Each truth is a chilling fragment that will make you tremble at the very mention of his name. This journey of discovery not only reveals the true face of a Tudor king, but also serves as a stark reminder of the dark side of absolute power. Prepare yourself, for ahead lies a sequence of tragedies enough to send a shiver down your spine. 12 tragic chapters, 12 axes striking the boundaries of morality, and 12 dark memories of a bloodthirsty king. We are not merely recounting history, but reflecting on the cold bite of power when it strips away humanity Join me as we step into the first chapter of this journey. And now, as the gloomy curtain of Chapter 2 falls, we prepare to confront the first truth, a tragic coda that ends Henry VIII's life in the most putrid and horrific manner. On that fateful night, St. George's Chapel no longer echoed with music or solemn rites. The candlelight flickered, as if clinging to a last, fragile hope. Upon the cold stone bier lay Henry VIII's corpse, swollen to such an extent that his sumptuous robes had become grotesque. His flesh, darkened and taut like overfilled balloons, pulsed with every breath of air, as though an internal storm of organs churned beneath mixing thick yellow, exudate with deep crimson droplets from his gangrenous wound. The stench of rot rose so powerfully that even still air carried its assault through the sanctuary. The stone walls seemed to gasp with each wave of toxic vapour, the moss clinging like shameful witnesses to this ghastly death. Servants passing by staggered, handkerchiefs trembling against their noses, struggling to stave off nausea. More than once, they turned away in panic, eyes reddened by tears, as if beholding the Tudor king's body tearing itself apart in the darkness. Beneath the coffin, once polished leather shoes lay abandoned, corroded by drips of urine and pus. Even the most precious jewels could not drown out the creaking of cracking bone as the corpse was lifted onto the bier. The candle's feeble glow did not drive back the shadows, but instead illuminated every fissure in the flesh, conjuring a miniature map of hell, with the right thigh as the epicenter of all agony. Legend says that, at the moment the coffin's lid was lifted to transfer the body to the crypt, a stray dog slipped inside and licked the oozing fluids. That act seemed the final indictment of Henry VIII's once mighty power. Even a lowly beast dared to consume the last remnants of his soul. The clack of its claws on stone sent shivers through the crowded court, and no one dared utter a word, as if fearing their voices would echo into the afterlife. In that instant, the crypt's walls seemed to close in, swallowing every gaze. The drip-drip of pus onto the stone floor rang out like a mournful funeral bell. Perhaps even these cold walls understood that Henry VIII's power existed only in scrolls and on the throne, not in the realm of decay. His corpse stood as the clearest proof. Ostentatious authority cannot reverse nature's laws of decomposition. In that suffocating space, a void crept into every corner. Ornate carved tables fell silent, bowing before the tragedy of one who once sat at the highest seat. The dancing candlelight painted a bleak tableau, a once majestic king reduced to a hollow shell of flesh, his odour serving as a warning to anyone who coveted power. The only remaining sound was the faint, ragged breathing of those on crypt duty. They bowed their heads, shoulders trembling, feeling shame on his behalf, shame for having served a towering monarch only to witness his body crumble into nature's cruel mockery. One of them gently touched the bier. A smear of thick yellow discharge, marking his fingertips. Once dry, that stain would etch itself into everyone's memory as the final vestige of utter ruin. If Henry VIII's mind retained any spark of awareness, it must have reflected an ultimate torment, buried beneath the shroud. He could not escape decay. The swelling, the fetid odour, the drip-drip of exuded fluid, all whirled together like an unending nightmare. Perhaps, in those final moments, his spirit recoiled at the realization that every brutal decree, every life shed by his blade in pursuit of an immortal throne, had not secured his own immortality. This putrid demise stands as a harsh parable on the limits of absolute power. Every drop of pus, every streak of blood, every fragment of flesh that fell away testified to one stark truth. A king may reshape institutions and behead enemies, but he cannot alter his body or overturn the laws of life and death. The witnesses turned away. Fosses parler? Mouths barely daring to breathe, fearing even a single inhalation would draw the rank stench deeper into their lungs. That night ended. Yet its echoes will haunt eternity, even under a cloak of silence. The Tudor palace retains the odour of decay and the crackling resonance of Henry VIII's death. In each heart lingers the same gnawing question. Once power and flesh have crumbled away, will the only imprint left be the tragedy of a bloodthirsty king, or a timeless reminder that, at the pinnacle of authority, man remains utterly powerless before nature's immutable law? Following the horrifying tragedy of his rotting demise, we now move on to Truth 2, the gangrenous wound that never heals, where both body and soul of Henry VIII are trapped in a relentless, unending nightmare. In January 1536, amid the biting fog of Greenwich, Henry was thrown from his horse by a devastating lance strike. When he regained consciousness, he found his right leg drenched in blood, flesh hollowed out, yellow pus, pulsing with every breath. The world around him seemed to freeze, mist creeping along the walkway, coating the slick rooftops, distant horses whinnying faintly across an empty field, a ghostly wind stirring the skeletal branches outside, as if trying to hush the wound's tortured moans. That very first night, Henry endured agony unlike anything before. The flickering oil lamp in the military surgeon's tent blurred his vision, and rivulets of treatment salve dripped onto the wooden floor in trembling hands. The surgeon applied glowing red-hot iron to cauterize the flesh, searing a smoke-filled wound into existence. Each sizzle sounded like a primal scream from Henry's skin, shattering the tense silence. The lamp's unsteady glow carved deep furrows into his once smooth face, where pain had rooted itself in his very soul. In the days that followed, arsenic and mercury became his unwelcome companions. Each time a caustic paste was spread across the flesh, the metallic stench surged 100-fold, clinging to every pore and reminding Henry that this was no passing trial, but a death sentence suspended over his leg. The torment ripped through his nerve endings like a violent storm, driving him to howl in delirium, to limp through the palace corridors, only to collapse again against the cold brick walls. The court shuddered at the roar of his agony echoing down the halls. No one dared approach. Handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar and rice wine were pressed desperately to their noses. Yet the stench still found a way in, as if determined to rob them of breath itself. Anyone who showed even a flicker of disgust was instantly rebuked, reminded that beneath the crown, every life must yield. In Henry's mind, loneliness pierced him like a jagged thorn. Once celebrated as the admired prince who strode confidently down red carpets, waving to his subjects, he now heard only the sickening crack of bone as tendon and muscle convulsed under his own weight. The candle's trembling light revealed patches of peeling skin, painting a vivid portrait of hell incarnate within the very chamber meant for healing. Night after night, sleep eluded Henry. He would sit by the frost-lined window, staring out at the snow-covered royal gardens, the bare branches like withered hands reaching toward the sky. The wind's howl through the branches whispered, "You will never heal." Each gust that rattled the window pane struck his heart as though hammering home the truth of the wound that clung to him with every breath. His body swelled from immobilization, but the gangrene only spread. Dead tissue festered. The rank odor, a constant reminder that nature would always prevail. Henry gingerly touched the scar, a chill running through his spine. He wondered if his body could decay so completely. Could his soul retain even a glimmer of light? Or had physical torment already obliterated all faith and hope? Helplessness enveloped him. Seeing servants hastily step back, he realized the reverence he once commanded had turned to fear. Every cautious glance and backward shuffle as he raised his leg spoke to the tragedy. Power could not heal flesh, and a throne could not stop gangrene from claiming his limb. When the surgeon approached with more metal instruments and acid-like treatments, Henry did not need to look to know it was another onslaught of iron and chemicals. He shuddered, lips parting as though to speak, "I was wrong to believe I could master everything with authority." His sigh echoed against the stone walls. The lament of a king severed from his own humanity. In troubled dreams, Henry heard rain drumming on the tiled roof. Each drop fell with a click like pus onto stone, jolting him awake with a shiver down his spine. Rain could wash away dirt, but this wound would only spread further, never to scab over. It dawned on him. This agony was unlike any earthly punishment. It emerged from within his own body, shattering every shred of power and reputation. Nature, in that winter rainstorm, seemed to sympathize with Henry. Yellow leaves tumbled aimlessly, lightning briefly, illuminating skeletal branches. The slow death of each fallen leaf mirrored Henry's irrevocable decay, layer upon layer, beyond repair. On a moss-coated wall, rainwater traced dark streaks, forming a grisly fresco of destruction, strikingly akin to the gangrenous lesion eating away at living flesh, day after day. Henry ceased to be the formidable monarch and became prey to perpetual torment. Each wave of pain ignited another burst of fury, making him harsh, prone to irrational anger. The once grand palace transformed into a prison, where the wound on Henry's leg ruled every corner. The air in his treatment chamber grew oppressive, dense as the surrounding fog. The stone walls absorbed moisture. Moss spread unchecked, each dark patch mirroring Henry's gloomy state of mind. The antiseptic odor of disinfectants could not erase the stench of rot, only intensify it, blending physical agony with chilling emotional desolation. Finally, Henry realized that this gangrene was the mirror to the unhealable nightmare in his soul. He feared a future without an heir. But more terrifying still was the thought that these scars would be etched forever in his mind. A constant reminder of the price of power and ambition. This is the second truth. The gangrenous wound that never heals, not only ravaging the flesh, but shredding the heart, marking Henry VIII's life indelibly. Below is the full, accurate English translation of the provided Vietnamese text. Following the haunting memory of the unhealable gangrenous wound, Henry VIII descended into a new tragedy. Truth 3. Obesity of shocking proportions, where his physical torment and thirst for power intertwined, plunging him into an uncontrollable spiral of weight gain. At first, Henry retained his impeccable figure, a slim 35 waist, a warrior's sculpted frame, striding regally through the palace corridors. But the leg injury, a grim souvenir of the fateful 1536 jousting accident, had turned him into a prisoner of his own body. His right leg could no longer bear weight, forcing Henry to remain seated all day, relying on servants to haul him about via pulleys. Hour by hour, his body consumed an enormous amount of food, roughly 0 kilocalorie per day, consisting solely of blazing red roast beef, smoke at hum, sumptuous feasts of premium wine, and frothy ale. Greens virtually disappeared from his table, replaced by every variety of rich, fatty meat slathered in cheese and hearty sauces. Each bite of dripping meat slid down his throat in momentary pleasure, only to leave his pancreas teetering. Warm blood coursed through his veins like fuel, yet it only nourished the relentless expansion of adipose tissue. The elegant candlelit banquets became scenes of bottomless hunger when a servant raised a chalice to his lips. Henry drank only half, pouring the remainder into a tray at his feet so he would not have to lift himself. Day by day, the very doublet that once hugged his muscular form stretched taut until its seams threatened to burst. The palace had to enlist craftsmen to reclaim space. Doors were widened, corridors enlarged, ancient tapestries removed. A specialized pulley system was built to move him from room to room. Mattresses were replaced by spring beds over 1 meter thick, complete with mechanical levers to raise his head or tilt the frame as desired. Whenever Henry was relocated, the rolling coffin bed clattered past ornate carvings, a constant reminder that he was no mere commoner, yet had lost his personal freedom. In Henry's psyche, each accumulating layer of fat gnawed at his last shred of pride. His eyes searched for the warrior he once was, but beheld only an inflated visage beneath his feathered cap. Each tilt of his head echoed unnaturally, like a drumbeat deep within his chest, reminding him that he must uphold a sovereign bearing, even as his body crumbled. The scent of grilled meat and brewing ale still lingered in the air when Henry inhaled deeply. The moisture-laden aroma of steak and cold beer invaded his sinuses, triggering sweat glands into overdrive. His brow beaded with sweat, his collar soaked through. Yet no confident perfume could mask the reek of burning fat. The palace's Imari-tiled walls, once vivid with mythological scenes, seemed to spit back the greasy stench. As if revolted by the onslaught of flesh, this physical appetite gradually turned into a spiritual hunger. Henry realized he needed more than lavish fare. He craved power. He craved the security of his dynasty's future. And he craved escape from his unhealable pain. Yet each meal deepened his depression as he saw his colossal shadow on the wall, a figure once heroic now reduced, in the mirror, to a cumbersome mass of flesh. Night after night, Henry lay on his mechanized bed, listening to the pulley wheels clatter as though on a pilgrimage to oblivion. But the pauper beneath his silken coverlet found no comfort. Silence enveloped him, broken only by his labored breathing and pervasive fatigue. He closed his eyes and pictured the awaiting 5-0 kilocalorie feast. But self-loathing welled up, as if the excess fat had seeped into his very core. A servant reported his vital signs: high blood pressure, an erratic heartbeat, gout's crimson, swelling in his toes, and pre-diabetic markers staining his blood. Henry read those numbers with detachment, as though they belonged to someone else. He had once declared, "If we desire war, we only need an army." But now he realized that army could not combat his clogged arteries or wage war on obstructed coronaries. Every breeze through the great windows carried a hiss of history. It whispered, "Power does not grant freedom. It leads you astray." He dreamed of the royal gardens in full bloom, where lush vines curled around his bust, now binding the pedestal like chains, preventing escape. The garden's emerald leaves reached out, as if pleading for his balance. Yet Henry saw only flabby limbs, unable to grasp anything but helplessness. In a twilight trance, Henry jolted awake. A withered yellow rose had fallen onto his bed, leaving a sticky smear like his own body's grease. Rain pounded the courtyard roof, fog seeping through the cracks. Nature itself mourning his monstrous form. Yet that very form became his final weapon. His bulk deterred any would-be assassin, forcing Henry to command respect from a distance. Power now operated through edicts and rosters, not handshakes. Every council met upon a raised dais, where Henry sat like an emperor, atop an icy peak aloof and remote. The Tudor palace, once a beacon of resplendent might, had become a prison of longing and torment. Its gleaming tiles could not fend off the stench of grease. Its luxurious rugs could not absorb his wheezing breaths. The space froze around him, as though an iceberg encasing Henry's spirit. And in a rare moment of clarity, Henry admitted the truth. His obesity was not merely the result of unrestrained indulgence, but the embodiment of his sins and obsessions. Each redundant roll of fat was another layer of crime, crimes against his former wives, against his kin, against the very ideals he once upheld. It served as proof that boundless ambition can assume a monstrous, consuming form that destroys even what it once revered. This is Truth 3. Obesity of shocking proportions, not only ravaging the body but choking the soul, transforming Henry VIII from a symbol of majesty into a lonely figure surrounded by excess flesh and inescapable pain. Just as the excess layers of fat and physical agony were beginning to fade from memory, we confront an even more insidious wound. Truth 4. Brain injury and the dawn of tyranny. The savage horsefall of 1536 did more than ruin Henry VIII's leg. It planted a profound trauma in his mind, propelling him from a proud prince into the private hell of his own making. At that moment, the jousting field at Greenwich thundered with hooves before falling into stunned silence. Henry was hurled to the ground, unconscious for more than 2 hours. When he at last stirred, he found himself alone among attendants, ears ringing, head spinning as if he were drunk. The flickering wax lantern revealed a grimace on his face, evidence of how violently his wits had careened off their course. From the instant of his recovery, Henry was no longer the same man. The palace itself seemed to sense the change. The corridors no longer echoed with his confident stride, but with the uneven thud of his faltering steps whenever he tried to stand. The once stately carved walls became alien and forbidding, as if the very stone slabs bore invisible daggers aimed at the mind of the king, who once prided himself on iron resolve. Many historians now assert that this undiagnosed cranial injury stripped Henry of emotional control, where once a gentle phrase or a warm smile could soothe his anger. Afterward, his rage erupted without warning like a volcanic blast, suddenly and without reason. Even the smallest inconvenient remark could ignite his fury, compelling him to issue execution orders without mercy. At night, Henry often awoke from feverish dreams to stare at a sliver of moonlight on the arched ceiling, anxiety clawing at his thoughts. He would wonder if that pale reflection in the window was his idolized self, or a paranoid madman scheming to usurp the throne. The wind's howl through the cracks deepened his fear of unseen enemies, making every hair on his head stand on end. In council meetings, Henry's gaze, once flaming with decisive authority, grew sombre and menacing. His stare felt like a chilling blade ready to cut down anyone daring to question or hesitate. He ignored his advisors' counsel and delivered swift, harsh judgments, driven by the paranoia that only he could perceive the threats swirling around his throne. Each political decree henceforth carried the chill of a blood-soaked storm, inaugurating an era of tyranny history would never forget. Whenever he crossed the cold stone walls, Henry felt his heart pound like a war drum. He loathed the sense of losing control over his own mind, fragmented memories of childhood, of his parents, of tearful romances, now twisting into bitterness rather than comfort. Some say he once hurled a quill into the wall and screamed in the royal library over a trivial line in a court document. By then, the palace had become a psychological labyrinth. Darkness crept into every corner, shrouding ancestral statues that seemed to come alive. Watching his every move, Henry saw his own distorted silhouette on the walls and in the mirror, the embodiment of bloodlust and paranoia. He realized that he had become the victim of a relentless internal war, where the greatest enemy was not an outsider, but the irreversible damage to his brain. In his private chambers, Henry would seal the windows and enclose himself in darkness to escape noise. Yet the clamour inside his head could not be silenced. The crack of a leather whip on flesh echoed through the walls from his arbitrary punishments of servants. Every sound seeping through the doorframe reminded him that absolute power only amplified the malignant tumour of his paranoia, leaving him unable to distinguish friend from foe. That fury spread through him much as gangrene once devoured his flesh. Henry began to suspect everyone around him, ministers, generals, even his own family. He forbade private audiences, ordered the verification of his illegitimate son's birth record, and sought to eliminate any seeds of rebellion. Once solemn tapestries now swirled before his eyes like giant question marks, poised to consume him. Not even the ticking clock in the library offered comfort. Each tick reminded him that time was counting down not to peace, but to mental collapse. Henry muttered that if this continued, the realm would plunge into chaos. He plotted nocturnal arrests and crushed dissent as though seeking safety amid a hurricane of his own making. The candles in his chambers grew pallid and ashy, as if they, too, witnessed the hardening of his heart. Sometimes he felt the wax whisper, "You have forgotten the days of laughter with friends, of embracing your wife." But such reminders only deepened his anguish that this brain injury had stolen his warm, humane side, leaving behind only the spectre of a tyrant. In one terrifying council session, Henry abruptly ordered the execution of a high official simply for a single misplaced seal. The Duke's finely carved axe rang out like the death knell of an age. Witnesses say that, after the blow fell, Henry sat in silence, gazing at the lofty ceiling as if seeking answers from the heavens, though his mind was awash with tangled speculations of hidden conspiracies. And in that moment, we witnessed the dreadful transformation from a king once esteemed for his virtue. Henry VIII had stepped onto the path of a despot, where reason gave way to merciless decree, and trust and loyalty dissolved under the influence of his brain injury. His mental strength plummeted, dragging an entire dynasty into a terrifying darkness. This is Truth 4, Brain Injury and the Dawn of Tyranny, the tragic turning point that carried Henry VIII from a position of glory into the shadowy empire of his own inner nightmare. And from the tyrannical dawn set in motion by his brain injury, Henry VIII plunged further into the abyss of Truth 5, Paranoia and the Bloody Rage, where his mind was besieged by conspiratorial phantoms, turning suspicion into a ceaseless blade that slaughtered across the court. Soon after, his anger flared without cause. Henry began to sink into deep depression. Each morning, the clatter of the food cauldron reminded him of his decaying body and the latent disease gnawing through his veins. At night, he lay in bed, hearing a servant's breath through the wooden wall and imagining whispers of betrayal. Thus his paranoia deepened. Every rustle, every sidelong glance seemed to conceal an assassination plot. The palace grew more stifling than ever. Candlelight in the council chamber flickered, casting quivering shadows across Henry's face as he scanned piles of documents. He imagined every period and every stroke of ink as the secret pact of an enemy. When courtiers brought in his wine, Henry suspected their goblets were poisoned. When letters arrived, he read every seal as proof of a coup. The most mundane details swelled into grand conspiracies in his mind, leaving him isolated in a sea of mistrust. Trust eroded, and Henry first ordered the examination of those closest to him, the palace guards, his chief justiciar, his private secretary. They were questioned relentlessly, sometimes in the very splendor of the royal chambers, under the horrified gaze of the ladies-in-waiting. Every hurried reply only stoked the clouds of suspicion in Henry's mind, driving him to a mad logic. If I cannot trust those nearest to me, then everyone is my enemy. Endery. Henry's rage peaked when Sir Thomas More, his closest friend and the kingdom's brightest mind, dared to refuse to address him as Supreme Head of the Church of England. Having once admired More's steadfast righteousness, Henry now saw a spectre of rebellion in him. A single polite refusal was enough to summon a secret trial. In the cramped, dimly lit room, More was seated on the witness stand, facing the king's blade. The interrogation was brief and tense, Henry's voice low and harsh as he demanded loyalty. More answered only with the convictions of his conscience. In that moment, raw power overwhelmed all reason, and the fatal signature was scrawled on the death warrant. It was not only Thomas More. Scores of courtiers, generals, and noble allies, who had once stood beside Henry, met the executioner's axe. History records that between 57, 000 and 72, 000, people perished beneath the blade soldiers, local officials, even children and the elderly. Each time a sentence was to be carried out, Henry donned his royal robes, sat upon his throne, and surveyed the trembling crowd before him, his gaze cold as steel fixed on every condemned soul as if to assert, there is no room here for any power but this throne. I'm Sir Bling. The execution grounds at the Tower of London became a public nightmare. Courtiers pressed shoulder to shoulder, their voices hoarse in cheers at each fall of the axe. Henry stood by the scaffold, cloak billowing, expression merciless and unsmiling. The scent of fresh blood, mingled with gunpowder and burning charcoal, searing itself into the memory of all present. In those most brutal moments, Henry felt a fleeting calm. He believed only terror could safeguard the throne from the shadows within. At night, when the palace sank into darkness, Henry often sat alone in a private chamber, a single lamp flickering beside him. He bowed his head, convinced his executions were a sacred duty. Even as his obsession grew ever darker, the wind's sigh through the shutters sounded like the murmurs of 1,000 souls. Only blood can cleanse the seeds of rebellion. Yet those whispers also reminded him of the countless innocent lives lost. Deep down, Henry understood that justice soaked in blood could not endure forever. But his paranoia had made him his own prisoner. No one could comfort him. No one could unlock the chains in his mind. Each heavy step he took carried the pall of guilt. Every breath he drew tasted of smoke and burnt flesh, a ceaseless reminder that his power had been bought with blood. Day by day, England's political life unravelled. The court transforming into a battle for survival, Henry no longer trusted ceremony or law, but only the sharp edge of the executioner's axe. Candlelight in the palace halls grew jaundiced. The grand carved walls yellowed, as if bowing before the tyrant's fury. Under the dim glow, Henry's law books slipped from his hands, lost in the gathering gloom. Having emerged from the dark night of paranoia and bloody wrath, we now return to the sorrowful story of a gentle woman, Truth 6, the meek wife, Katherine of Aragon cast aside. After over 2 decades of unwavering loyalty, she who was once the very embodiment of virtue and beauty proved unable to hold the heart of a king, consumed by his thirst for power. In the early years of their marriage, Katherine of Aragon was hailed as the guiding light of the Tudor court. Laughter filled the palace as she glided through banquets, a rose in hand and silk skirts billowing behind her. From the castle's lofty windows to the flower-brightened royal gardens, she shone like a lotus amid the marsh of nobility. All admired her generous spirit, how she comforted the eunuchs, soothed orphaned children, and tended the sick in the gilded chambers. But soon the obsession with securing a male heir cast a long, dreary shadow over those halcyon days. Katherine bore child again and again. Mary, her sole daughter, became her singular pride. Yet with each newborn daughter, Henry's disappointment deepened his hope of a prince fading like a portrait's colours. The palace grew silent. The music of feasts was replaced by the hollow echo of a heart left empty. One autumn afternoon, Katherine sat in her private pavilion, her hand trembling over an embroidery hoop. Sunbeams pierced the lattice, painting thin lines of light on the wall. Yet inside her all was confusion and dread. She gazed out at the rose garden, its yellow bloom still opening, but felt herself turn to stone. Her hope evaporated. She recalled her wedding day, when triumphant drums had sounded, and she believed love would endure as steadfastly as rock, never imagining it would dissolve like morning mist. Then came the cruel day when Henry formally declared their marriage annulled. Katherine collapsed in the courtyard, the wind howling through the columns like the cry of justice betrayed. Courtiers stood hushed on either side, breaths caught in their throats as they watched the woman who had given her life cast out from the centre of power. It felt as though the world had split in two, half consumed by impenetrable darkness, the other half bathed in a pale light that could not dispel the cruelty. They imprisoned Katherine in the damp diamond palace, its walls mottled with mould, and its narrow windows opening only onto a desolate courtyard. Day after day she sat at a stone table, dabbing tears onto her book of hours, eyes rimmed red as if longing for a miracle. Servants brought her meals, but she had no appetite, each bite of bread bitter with betrayal. Her mind felt shattered into 1,000 pieces, drifting away like autumn leaves in the wind. Katherine was not only confined but publicly humiliated. At court ceremonies, her name was announced with disdain, since she could not produce a prince. The queen is unworthy of her title. Beneath glaring torches, she stood alone among the assembled court. A thin veil across her shoulders could not hide the torrent of tears streaming down her face. Each drop carried the weight of broken faith and the humiliation of a wife discarded, as if her wedding gown were passé. Night after night, Katherine lay upon a creaking wooden bed, her head resting on a cold pillow. The wind's hiss through the shutters sounded like whispers from the past. You were once queen, once beloved, yet she lacked the strength to repeat the claim. All she heard was her own heart's sighs. Each beat shackled by fate, the world around her became a mirror to Katherine's soul. The rose garden outside the palace lay silent, petals strewn across the walk like reminders of withered youth. The rough stone columns, mottled with moss, recalled the barrier that now stood between her and the throne. At dusk, the dying rays of sun outlined Katherine's small, solitary figure, alone in a tableau of power and abandonment. She yearned to hear Mary's laughter once more, to see her daughter grown strong. But Henry's power had stolen away those familial embraces. Portraits of mother and daughter hung forlornly in the chapel, a gust of wind stirring the curtains to make Mary's painted figure tremble as though waiting for her mother's return. Katherine would gaze at that portrait, tears blurring the ink, her heart wrenching at their separation. Still, Katherine held on to one fragment of hope, that her human dignity could never be wholly destroyed. When she learned that Mary's status as princess had been reaffirmed, Katherine managed a faint smile. Though cast aside as queen, she remained the mother of the realm's only heir, a slender vestige of honour no one could strip from her. At last, Katherine took leave of the cold palace, journeying to her place of exile while she wrote to Mary, "Keep your heart compassionate. Do not let cruel power harden your soul." The delicate letter, once sealed, flew through the castle gates like a fragile butterfly, flitting past stone ramparts. And rising above Katherine's tragedy, we continue our journey with Truth 7, the tragedy of Anne Boleyn, the betrayer. In the dim light of the royal gallery, where the portrait of Anne, smiling beside Henry, hung aloft, few suspected that this image marked the beginning of an irreparable catastrophe. At first, Anne Boleyn appeared like an exotic rose in the arid Tudor garden. Legend has it that with but a few graceful steps and a provocative glance, she stole Henry VIII's heart so completely that he dared to break Rome's centuries-old authority. The palace buzzed. Music swelled at every feast when Anne entered, slender and pale as alabaster at the king's side. Candlelight dancing upon her brow seemed to sketch even more allure, enthralling Henry and blinding him to all reason. Yet it was power and desire that proved the poison between Henry and Anne. 3 brief years of happiness turned into 3 years of Anne struggling against whispers and slanders. The court now teemed with envious stares, and even the most trusted hands concealed hidden daggers. Whenever she smiled at Mary, her only daughter, the fissures in the court's loyalty bled anew, as if to remind her that beauty and wit alone could not shield her from the winds of authority. The true tragedy began when Michael Hanson, a high-ranking pro-Roman official, delivered forged documents to Henry. A war of words erupted in the royal household. Anne was accused of adultery with every celebrated noble, from Mark Smeaton to her own brother, George Boleyn. Fabricated charges of incest and conspiracy to assassinate the king were meticulously compiled. The false evidence laid out in battalions, convincing Henry that she had betrayed him to his very bones. On the day of her trial, the atmosphere grew suffocating. A tribunal was erected before the castle gates. The courtiers gathered in anxious throngs, their eyes fixed upon her. Dressed in a simple black gown, Anne ascended the platform with composure, gently laying her hands on the cold wooden table. She met Henry's gaze, seeking one last glimmer of mercy. But Henry, transformed into an unfeeling judge, sat high upon his throne, his dark eyes stormy and unblinking, ready to renounce the ardour of the past. When the death sentence was pronounced, the applause that followed sounded like a hammer crushing Anne's heart. This once alluring lady was branded a traitor, condemned to the severest penalty solely for Henry's ambition to conquer Rome. In her final moments, Anne knelt on the scaffold, her hair falling in dark waves down her back, and offered her gentle smile to her attendant. with her last whispered words, "In my faith." "I am innocent," the blade flashed, severing her breath. It was not romance, but Henry's fickleness that etched this tragic mark. Anne, once the king's cherished queen, became a spectre upon the castle's stone walls. They say that after her execution, the wind moaned through the unguarded windows like Anne's spirit crying out, echoing down the cold corridors. Anne Boleyn's story stands as a stark reflection of the ruthless nature of feudal power. The woman who once inspired hope in Mary, who drove Henry to sunder the church, ultimately fell victim to the very machinations of the royal court. Beneath moonlight, the Tower of London still seems to carry the chilling sighs of her ghost, reminding us that the emperor's heart held not only joy and authority, but also the abyss of betrayal. And following the bloody tragedy of Anne Boleyn, the palace echoes with a new breath, if only for a moment, when truth ate. The unjust death of Jane Seymour unveils yet another chapter of Tudor sorrow, where hope for the final heir mingles with an irreparable grief. Jane Seymour entered Henry VIII's life like a warm breeze in the chill, discreet, gentle, and far less talkative than her predecessors. She brought an unusual calm to the royal court. In those autumnal days, Jane often withdrew to the higher gardens, where red maples unfurled their leaves. There she sat beside bushes of white roses, the golden dusk outlining her hair. Each measured step she took seemed to ease the tension at the throne, prompting courtiers to whisper, "At last, the king has found a soulmate." When Jane gave birth to Prince Edward on the 12th of October, the palace burst into triumphant bells. Drums thundered across the ancient courtyards, and cries of "He lives!" rang out like a blinding light, dispelling the dark clouds that had long hovered over the court. Henry VIII allowed a rare smile to grace his lips, his eyes glittering with joy. He held Jane close, pressing a kiss upon her that was more earnest than any love poem. Mary, the elder princess, trembled at his side, astonished to hear her brother's name proclaimed before so many admiring gazes. But that happiness did not last. A mere 12 days later, Jane fell gravely ill, her strength ebbing away. The palace must have shuddered as nurses' hurried footsteps and whispered anxieties filled the halls at all hours. They applied damp cloths and stroked her with herbal salves, yet could not save her from the horrific complications of childbirth. Blood soaked the silk sheets, and her final, faint heartbeat stilled. Gentle as a wilting white rose, Jane drew her last breath in Henry's broken arms. After her death, Henry draped himself in black, his gaze more sorrowful than ever before. Many at court bowed their heads and agreed. Jane Seymour was the only wife whose loss truly pained Henry. Every afternoon, he visited her grave in St. George's Chapel garden, laying white roses there, Jane's favourite flower. Candles slowly burned beside her tomb, and the breeze stilled its rustle, as if holding its breath in remembrance of the departed. Yet amid the praise and tears there arose malicious whispers. Jane had merely been fortunate to die early, before becoming the next victim of royal ambition. They claimed that, had she lived longer, Henry would have quickly grown bored and sought another replacement, just as he did with Katherine and Anne. They argued that the grief Henry displayed was nothing more than fleeting regret, not enduring love. After those solemn nights, the palace would again ring with music and the footsteps of a new queen. As power's wheel turned ever onward, in the minds of Katherine, Anne, and Jane, we see power as a ravenous beast. It devours affection, loyalty, and even the very flesh of those it claims. Jane, who once brought hope to the Tudor line, now remains only a fleeting legend. They say that on moonlit nights, white rose petals still drift in the puddles before Jane's tomb, a reminder that in this court there is no place for personal tenderness. Jane's death will forever pose questions about sincerity and the worth of love under a brutal reign. Did Henry truly mourn? Or did he only grieve the loss of the sole key to his power? In the vaulted nave of St. Wani, George's bells toll mournfully each October. In Edward's honour, visitors come to lay wreaths and depart in silence, carrying away an unspoken sorrow. And scarcely had the sorrow over Jane Seymour's unjust death begun to subside when the Tudor court was rocked by a new tragedy. Truth 9. The teenage angel, Katherine Howard. At just 17, she became Henry VIII's fifth queen, bearing the hope of rekindling the king's love. Yet, after only a few months of bliss, she faced execution at 19, and rumours arose of her restless spirit wandering the Hampton Court corridors, begging for mercy. Katherine Howard swept into Henry's life like a gentle summer breeze. Her hair shone gold by candlelight, her skin as smooth as polished marble, bringing a breath of youthful life to a court stained by blood. Laughter echoed through the palace when she stood beside the king, her wavy locks grazing her shoulders, a diaphanous silk gown hinting at her angelic form. Henry, who had endured so much pain and betrayal, seemed to forget his scars at Catherine's innocent gaze. But this fragile angel could not endure the royal court for long. Less than half a year after their wedding, Katherine was discovered in adultery with Thomas Culpeper, one of the king's most trusted guards. The sensational scandal spread like wildfire through the realm. It is said she was caught red-handed in a private chamber, her eyes widening in horror under the flickering lamp, her pleadings choked off by the hushed footsteps at the door. Henry, by now hardened to betrayal, felt the sting of this deceit like a knife to his pride. Though Katherine wept and begged for clemency, he showed no mercy, determined to punish her disgrace. Henry immediately ordered a swift trial, the palace filled with an oppressive atmosphere. Black mourning cloaks draped every column. Candle smoke, thick, with the acrid scent of disinfectant. When the death sentence was pronounced, Katherine bowed her head at the bar, her shoulders trembling like a fragile leaf. She stammered pleas for her life, her eyes glistening with tears, as if accusing herself of being too young to grasp the weight of the crown she bore. Yet Henry, seated above her on his lofty throne, signed the warrant in cold silence, his heart seemingly frozen by repeated betrayals. On the day of execution, the scaffold and its iron blade lay waiting in the Hampton Court courtyard. Courtiers formed silent ranks, their faces pale at the sight of horror. Katherine, dressed in a simple white mourning robe, was led to the block. She knelt, glancing back at the glittering palace that had echoed with royal laughter only months before. She murmured her final prayer in a quavering voice. "O Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." A few seconds later, the blade fell, and the whisper of the wind mournfully mourned the youth that had just withered. From that day on, it was said that Katherine Howard's spirit never found rest. In the dead of night, through the Hampton Court corridors, ghostly white forms drift across flower-edged windows, leaving behind a faint scent of peach blossoms, her favourite perfume. Her desperate pleas, carried on the cold stone arches, echo faintly, "Have mercy on me, please," and strike terror into any mortal who chances to wander there. The tale of this teenage angel's beheading stands as a bloody lesson in the cruelty of the court. Henry VIII, who once tore down religious order to wed Anne Boleyn, readily beheaded this naive girl over mere rumours. Behind the power and splendour of the throne lay an abyss of personal tragedy, where a single misplaced glance could condemn a life to hell. By the faint candlelight of night, Katherine's silhouette flickers on damp brick walls. Her golden hair, once a radiant halo, is scattered by the wind, her delicate features smudged by tears. It is said that anyone bold enough to set foot on the banister staircase after midnight will hear the rustle of her white gown across the stone floor, an accumulation of human sorrow bound to that corridor. Just as the mournful haze over Katherine Howard had not yet lifted, The Tudor court reeled at another chapter of sorrow. Truth 10. The public humiliation of Anne of Cleves, Henry VIII, already steeped in grief and betrayal, now demonstrated how power can become a weapon aimed squarely at those once called wife. I'm 7. At first, Anne of Cleves existed before Henry, only in painted portrait form. She appeared graceful and refined, her delicate features befitting a queen, thirsty for a fresh love. After so many losses, Henry agreed to the marriage at a single glance. On the 6th of January, they wed in grand ceremony at Greenwich. Drums thundered in the great hall. Anne radiant in a gold-trimmed wedding gown, her gentle smile promising new hope for the realm. Yet everything changed after their first meeting at Windsor, as Henry stepped from the barge into the winter sunshine at Whitehall and saw Anne in her ceremonial attire. He blurted out a bitter insult. "She's as ugly as a Flemish mare." The palace fell silent. Then murmurs of gossip swept through every corridor. Her once charming smile stiffened, and her alabaster complexion seemed suddenly pallid and unkind. Henry's scorn did not stop at words. He ordered Anne to appear before the court in the great hall. When she ascended the dais, 1,000 curious and contemptuous eyes bore into her. Whispers and mocking laughter rippled through the chamber. Henry sat high on his throne, his gaze as if savouring a cruel spectacle of his own making. Each step Anne took felt like another wound to her dignity. She had been reduced to a laughingstock amid royal splendour. Even in dissolving the marriage after only 6 months, Henry refused to let Anne depart quietly. He insisted she publicly acknowledge their union null and void. The royal decree, complete with the remark, "due to looks not matching the portrait," was sealed and dispatched across England. A painful reminder that anyone who dared deceive the throne would face public mockery. Though she escaped the tragic fates of Anne Boleyn and Katherine Howard, Anne of Cleves could not hide her shame. She took up residence at Hever Castle, where a sign proclaimed, "Anne, Princess of Cleves, former wife of Henry VIII," forcing every visitor into awkward acknowledgement. Her new home held no grandeur, only the echoes of a love rejected. What stands out is Anne's nobility of spirit in the face of scandal. Instead of bitterness, she accepted all conditions, a generous jointure, the honorary title King's Sister, and invitations to royal festivities. Anne behaved with gracious composure, visiting Tudor relations when she could, earning admiration for maintaining her self-respect and kindness, despite public humiliation. It was said that whenever Henry appeared at court, Queens Mary and Elizabeth bowed respectfully to Anne, and even the late Katherine Howard was mentioned with reverence. Anne became a symbol of mercy within a harsh court, proving that though crushed by power, one's humanity need not be lost. On moonlit nights when the palace lay silent, some claimed they saw Anne peeking behind a curtain, cradling a teacup and smiling gently as if to convey, "I am well, and I pray you look into your own hearts." Her soft laughter and the faint perfume of peonies, her favourite bloom, wafted through the window, affirming that public disgrace could not erase true dignity. Having seen how Henry VIII's vanity could publicly shame even a gentle queen, we now turn to an even darker revelation. Truth 11. The incestuous scheme with his illegitimate son. In a desperation born of thwarted hopes and a dynastic curse, Henry contemplated legitimizing and marrying his recognized bastard, Henry Fitzroy, to his only legitimate daughter, Mary. That this proposal once gained serious consideration in Rome lays bare the lengths to which the Tudor king was willing to defy every moral boundary for the sake of a male heir. After the tragic early deaths of his legitimate sons Edward and others who never survived infancy, Henry VIII felt the Tudor line perilously close to extinction. He had already torn England from papal authority, so he might divorce Katherine of Aragon in pursuit of a male successor. Yet with Edward's health failing and mortality looming, even that monumental break seemed insufficient. Into this vacuum of fear and ambition stepped Henry Fitzroy, his acknowledged son by Elizabeth, Bessie, Blount. Fitzroy was created Duke of Richmond and Somerset in 1525. Lavishly endowed with lands and titles, his existence formed both a glimmer of hope and an unsettling reminder that Henry's own marriage had repeatedly failed to produce a healthy boy. By the late 1532, whispers began circulating. If Edward died, could Fitzroy, the only living son of Henry VIII's blood, to be elevated to secure the succession? Worse. Henry reportedly toyed with an incestuous union between Fitzroy and Mary Tudor, his legitimate daughter by Katherine of Aragon. Such a marriage would not only unite both branches of his lineage, but also place the crown firmly on a male head, even if that head was born out of wedlock. Contemporary observers recoiled at the suggestion, but the fact that the proposal reached the desks of cardinals in Rome testifies to Henry's single-minded resolve. In 1536, as Edward's fragile health worsened, Henry dispatched envoys to the Vatican seeking a papal dispensation for this abhorrent match. The papacy, desperate to maintain some influence over English affairs, despite the schism, quietly mulled the idea. Official records hint at letters exchanged between Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, and leading Italian prelates, debating whether an incestuous union could be justified under extreme necessity. These communications reveal the unprecedented breach of Christian moral law that Henry was ready to enact. Yet even Fitzroy's robust youth, he was in his early teens by then, could not extinguish the horror such a plan inspired. Mary herself, barely 10 years old, would have been thrust into a role no girl could comprehend. English clerics and noble families learned of the scheme in hushed corridors and private chambers. Many trembled before Henry's power. Few dared oppose him openly. But the rumours alone shattered the last illusions of decency surrounding the Tudor court. To contemplate marrying father's bastard son to his own daughter was to abandon every convention of church, state, and family. By 1539, Fitzroy's health also began to fail. He contracted tuberculosis, or what Tudor doctors called consumption, and died suddenly at age 17 in July 1536. His untimely death spared England the nightmare of a royal incest, and Henry, heartbroken, yet pragmatic, dropped the scheme as swiftly as it had arisen. But the stain of the proposal remained. In the months that followed, Henry turned once more to foreign alliances and further marriages, as though each new bride might erase the memory of his darkest reckoning. Court gossip insisted that Henry never fully recovered from Fitzroy's loss. Portraits of the youthful Duke, proud in his ducal robes, were quietly removed from galleries. His funerary monuments in St. Michael's Church, Lambeth, stood as silent memorials to a promise never realized. Mary, meanwhile, grew up subject to shifting probate acts and revised succession statutes, her very legitimacy at times undermined by her father's desperate calculations. She witnessed, from her own chamber doors, the lengths to which her father would go to manufacture a male ruler. In the years before his death, Henry would reflect bitterly on the fleeting comfort Fitzroy had offered. "He was the nearest thing I had to a boy worth my name," he is said to have lamented. Yet even that approximation of dynasty born of a mistress, not a queen, proved transient. When Fitzroy died, Henry sank into despair that outlasted many subsequent marriages. His ministers, too, learned the lesson. Absolute power, unchecked by moral constraint, leads swiftly to ruinous extremes. Looking back, historians recognize this incestuous proposal as the apogee of Henry's dynastic mania. It was not mere grand ambition, but an utter collapse of ethical restraint. For a brief, haunting moment, 16th century Europe could have witnessed a crown pass through incest. Sanctioned by papal dispensations, the ultimate betrayal of both family and faith. That the plan was abandoned only because death intervened does not lessen its horror. Rather, It underscores how perilously close Tudor England came to defying the very bedrock of Christian morality. Just as the incestuous scheme laid bare the extremities of Henry's desperation for a male heir, we arrive at Truth 12, the massacre of kin and allies, where the Tudor king's paranoia and thirst for absolute power drove him to slaughter even those closest to him. Beyond his ill-fated marriages and the execution of beloved wives, Henry VIII turned his merciless gaze toward his own blood and former friends. In 1541, he targeted Princess Margaret Pole, the 7-year-old Countess of Salisbury and the last surviving member of the Plantagenet dynasty. Margaret's lineage made her a potential rallying point for any faction opposed to Tudor rule, and her steadfast loyalty to Katherine of Aragon and the old faith alarmed a king already plagued by conspiratorial fever, arrested on spurious charges of treason. She languished in the Tower of London for over 2 years, her only crime being the accident of her birth. Ultimately brought to trial in a brief kangaroo court, Margaret was condemned to death. The executioner, inexperienced and rushed, delivered 11 savage blows before severing her head, an ordeal so gruesome that witnesses describe her final moments as a martyr's testament to Henry's cruelty. While Margaret's demise illustrated Henry's willingness to annihilate royal blood, the fate of Sir Thomas More revealed how no loyal subject was safe if he refused to affirm the king's supremacy. More, the celebrated Lord Chancellor, had forged his reputation as a scholar, humanist, and man of conscience. His refusal to endorse the Act of Supremacy and thus recognize Henry as head of the Church of England marked him as an enemy of the state. In 1535, More was arrested, imprisoned in the Tower, and subjected to months of coercion. His trial was a mockery of justice. Accused of treason for denying the king's spiritual authority, he was found guilty on absurd grounds. On the 6th of July, Etienne by Saint-Chou, More mounted the scaffold at Tower Hill, where he addressed the crowd with calm dignity, declaring that he died the king's good servant. But God's first, the blade fell and his head rolled at the feet of a monarch who viewed such integrity as a deadly threat. Henry's brutal treatment of Margaret Pole and Thomas More underscores how absolute power, when mixed with paranoia, can consume even those who once walked in the innermost circles of the court. Margaret, by virtue of birth, posed an abstract risk. More, by virtue of conscience, posed a moral challenge. In both cases, Henry sacrificed mercy on the altar of his own authority. The execution of a 76-year-old grandmother and the beheading of one of England's greatest minds sent a chilling message. No rank, no age, no past service could shield a person from the king's wrath. Moreover, these purges shattered the last vestiges of trust between ruler and ruled. Noble families, seeing Margaret Pole struck down, realized that lineage was no guarantee of safety. Courtier, witnessing More's refusal and downfall, I understood that loyalty to the king demanded not only political obedience, but spiritual capitulation. The Tower of London, once a bastion of royal defence, became a charnel house of Tudor justice, echoing with the cries of those whose only crimes were blood ties or unwavering principles. By the end of his reign, Henry VIII had emptied the bench of venerable councillors and nearly extinguished the Plantagenet claim that once threatened his throne. His final years were spent in fear of plots real and imagined. Surrounded by sycophants who dared not offer counsel lest their heads follow, England emerged from his rule, politically centralized but spiritually fractured. Its society scarred by the spectacle of a king who could turn from doting father to ruthless executioner. In an instant, having traversed 25 tumultuous years of one of Europe's most notorious reigns, our journey through the 12 horrifying truths about Henry VIII has painted a tragic portrait of a man whose absolute power turned him into a monster. Once a celebrated prince renowned for his athletic build and prodigious talent, he sank deeper into the swamp of paranoia. Haunted by the obsession for a male heir, and the unhealed concussion from that fateful jousting accident. Each tragic chapter, from the rotting corpse and the unending gangrene, to the grotesque obesity and the incestuous experiment with his illegitimate son, demonstrates how unrestrained authority can crush humanity itself and plunge its possessor into a bottomless abyss. Our Odyssey began with the chilling image of Henry VIII's corpse, swollen and fetid, a stark warning that no earthly power can conquer nature's laws of decay. From there, we witnessed the unhealing leg wound that screamed through sleepless nights, the heroic frame reduced to an obese prison, each movement a requiem of pain. We plunged into the delirium of his brain injury, where madness and murderous rage turned him against friends and kin alike. We observed the fates of 15 wives and would-be heirs, Katherine of Aragon cast aside after 20 years of loyalty, Anne Boleyn falsely accused and executed, Jane Seymour dying in childbed amid cheers, Catherine Howard beheaded as a 17-year-old angel, and Anne of Cleves publicly humiliated after 6 short months. We even explored Henry's 2 most monstrous schemes, the incestuous marriage he contemplated between his bastard son, Henry Fitzroy, and his daughter Mary, and the slaughter of loyal supporters. Most horrifyingly, the 76-year-old Princess Margaret Pole, felled by 11 blows, and Sir Thomas More, a paragon of conscience who chose faith over royal fiat. Looking back, one detects a constant current of tragedy. Henry VIII was not merely a bloodthirsty tyrant, but the archetypal human tragedy of power unchecked. The cost of his dynastic immortality was measured not only in mountains of bones, but in the utter loneliness of a king who lost his spiritual life, his capacity for trust, and, ultimately, his own humanity. At the end of his life, Henry VIII quietly passed away in a shadowed chamber, his body ravaged by disease, festering wounds, and grotesque obesity. No tears marked his passing, only fear and suspicion. His corpse was more than a relic. It became a cautionary tale about the limits of power and the helplessness of man before fate. And now, as we close the chapter on this tragic history of a sovereign at the summit of authority, we must ask ourselves, what lesson does Henry VIII teach us? It is a stark reminder that absolute power should never be entrusted to any one individual. Whenever ambition goes unchecked by conscience, justice, or morality, it metamorphoses into an invisible monster, ruthless and uncompromising. Let the story of Henry VIII remind us of the value of balance between power and responsibility, between trust and skepticism, between passion and reason. As we build political institutions and choose our leaders, let us never forget the blood-soaked lessons of the past. Only by constraining authority with law, ethics, and compassion can we hope to avoid repeating such tragedies. If you found this video enlightening, please hit subscribe to join us in uncovering more dramatic stories from history, and share your thoughts below. Tell us which truth about Henry VIII struck you the most, and what lesson you have drawn for your own journey in understanding power and humanity.